Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of CIRCA, I welcome you all to today's lecture on airborne disease transmission, what we have learned during COVID-19. This lecture would be delivered by Professor Alan Hedge, who is an eminent international expert on indoor air quality and who, apart from his several accomplishments, is also the founding member of the International Association for Indoor Air Quality and Health. He has taught for more than 40 years at the University of Cornell in Aston. Welcome aboard, Alan. CIRCA is really proud to have you with us today. I now would like to invite our honorable founder, Mr. Arun Dugal, for formally welcoming Professor Alan and all the participants, and also share his opening remarks with us.
Thank you, Hemant. This is indeed a great pleasure and an honor for me to invite Dr. Alan Hedge for this lecture. He's a world-renowned scientist who's been working on air quality, indoor quality in particular, for a long time. We had the honor of welcoming him in CIRCA a couple of years ago, and our association with him over the time has strengthened. The topic he's going to talk about is a new topic, but a very important topic under the current circumstances. And therefore, I think it will benefit all of us to learn about this issue, which is being faced not only in the US, but all over the world. People are struggling to figure out what is the impact of this airborne particles on the air quality and the health of individuals. So with that, if I could just ask Professor Sagnik Day to handle the program from this point on.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Dugal. Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Alan Hedge, who has a remarkable career of more than 4 decades. He has been teaching at Cornell University for more than 32 years and at Aston University, UK for more than 11 years. While at Cornell, he also was a research professor in the departments of biomedical engineering and mechanical and aerospace engineering at Syracuse University for more than 10 years. He has published 4 books, 40 book chapters, and over 250 articles. He was a founding member of the International Association of Indoor Air Quality and Health. He is a fellow of the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society, USA, of the International Ergonomics Association, of the Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors, UK, a certified professional ergonomist, and a chartered ergonomist. He is the environmental design representative for the International Ergonomics Association, and also he is an honorary research fellow of CIRCA. Alan, welcome again. It's a great pleasure to host you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you all for your very generous and gracious introduction. It's my pleasure to talk to you about something that is very near and dear to my heart, and that is the importance of the indoor environment in our lives. And I'm going to now hopefully share my screen with you. Oh boy, I have to go through a few little jobs here, so allow this. Come on, WebEx. It says it's connecting, and so give me a moment while it tries to find my screen. Select window or screen. This is the one I want. Right, okay. Hopefully you can all see this presentation.
Yes.
What I want to talk to you about today is forget about the virus as a biological entity and think about the virus as an ultrafine particle. which is really what it is, and then think about what we can actually do to change how that virus may be transmitted between different individuals. Now, part of the problem with COVID is that at the very beginning of this pandemic, which is not that long ago, just over a year ago, the World Health Organization issued this statement, and they said, COVID is not airborne. That was a disastrous statement because they were correct, but they were correct in the wrong way. As far as we know, it's not an airborne pathogen when you are outside with nothing around you, right? Like on a mountaintop. So it's not blowing from one place to another place, but it clearly is airborne because it spreads with respiratory droplets, and they're produced by people who may actually have the virus and may not even have symptoms, right? You can have people carrying the disease and expelling the disease. And that's what I want to look at today. I want to look at what do we know about how pathogens and indeed other particles move through the air and between individuals. So I'm going to be looking at airborne disease transmission and focusing on droplets and aerosols. Again, in the early days of COVID, we thought that touching objects might be the way that the virus was transmitted. And there was a lot of research on what is called fomite transmission, but that doesn't seem to be the main pathway by which an individual will be exposed to this virus. It's droplets and aerosols. So what do we know about this? Let me turn the clock back just a little bit. Over history, we've had many plagues. And the traditional view of plagues was that they were caused by bad air. They were caused by bad smells in the air, and hence the word malodor from the French, meaning, air that can cause an illness. And so when we had a plague like the Black Death, the doctors would wear a mask that was packed full of fragrant herbs and spices to try and make it smell better. It's like putting perfume or aftershave on you, hoping that that's going to change the disease risk. But of course, we now know that if you're dealing with something that is not a gas, then it's not anything to do with smell.
Professor, sorry to interrupt. Actually, your slides are not moving. If you can...
they're not moving. Oh,
Yeah.
let me just let me see what is going on here then. They're moving on mine, so let me just see. Okay, let me see if I go to this one. Is this slide moving? Did that move?
Not in my screen. I don't know. Hemant, is it?
No, not in my screen also. It's still.
Oh, this is interesting because it says I'm sharing my screen. So maybe let me see, maybe I have to share.
Maybe you have to share the full screen or something.
That's what I'm looking for. So this is the full screen.
Yeah, actually, when you are clicking on full screen, it's not coming full screen in ours.
It's not. Okay, let me stop sharing that and let me try again. Thank you very much for telling me. I would have been like the professor who gave a 2-hour presentation and his microphone was on mute the whole time. So we don't. Can you see that full screen? Are you seeing anything full screen there?
Not yet.
No.
Connection. Use the camera, use the microphone. Is there something that you have to do to allow me to?
When you are clicking on the share button.
Yeah, the share button. I'll share the application. Let's see if that does it. I shared the screen before. Let me see if I can share an application.
Yeah, sure.
Let me personally say that, so I've used many video conferencing software programs recently, and WebEx is probably one of the least user-friendly versions. So let me see. It's still trying to get to share content here. Okay, I want to select the window and screen. Let me try this now. Allow it. So can you now see the screen?
Yes, now it's full screen.
That changed?
Yeah, and it's moving. Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, so let me tell you the solution.
Please continue.
The solution is not to select the software. The solution is, if you go, there's a drop-down list, and way down on that list, it says, share the slideshow. So that's very confusing. I apologize for that. So this is what I was saying, the World Health Organization saying that airborne spread isn't a source of COVID. It turns out, I think that is wrong, but it's partly right. In other words, at great distances, airborne spread isn't a major factor. But at close distances, airborne spread is a major factor, in fact, the major factor for exposure. And so what I want to look at here are airborne disease transmission information that we have for droplets and aerosols. And I was talking about the plague doctors, as you see the mask here of a plague doctor, stuffed with fragrant herbs and spices. So it wasn't until just over 100 years ago, when the germ theory developed, that people began to realize that there were microorganisms, bacteria. Again, at this time, people didn't really know about viruses, it was bacteria. And because of these small organisms, a German researcher, a bacteriologist called Pfluger, began to realize that the bacteria could be inside droplets, and that when you breathed out, or when you spoke, or when you coughed or you sneezed, those droplets were released into the environment. And he demonstrated that, even in the early, even in somebody just speaking, these droplets would be spread out. If you have a laptop computer, you'll know this, because your screen will be covered in saliva droplets that have dried out from you doing video conferencing like this. And so we began to realize in the air quality community, and I guess maybe about, if I turn my clock back, the real emphasis was about 50 years ago, to start to think about, when you breathe, you're not breathing all of the air in an environment. Ventilation tends to talk about whole air changes in rooms. But the fact is, most of that air is air that an individual doesn't breathe. And what you're breathing is air that is much closer to you as an individual, in what we call a personal cloud, or your breathing zone. And that usually is from sitting height to standing height, and within about 1/3 of a meter of your face. So you can have pathogenic organisms in the air, but if they're not in that breathing zone, the chance of you being exposed isn't that great. What this has done in the last few years now, it's encouraged much greater research on looking at airborne droplets. And we now know that with normal breathing, you can see a whole series of research studies here, people will expel droplets from their mouth that vary in size from about 0.1 to about 8 microns in size. Most viruses are going to be submicronic, and most bacteria are low micronic, small micronic. And then we get into some of the larger particles. So we talk about something like PM 2.5, but that is huge. I mean, there are very few bacteria are that large, and no viruses are anywhere near that large. So, it's a very, very gross measure of what might be in the air. Now, we also know, when you look at patients who have some kind of infection, that not only do they breathe out more particles, but the size range of those particles tends to change as well. And again, this is fairly recent research, and there's ongoing research on this. We now know that with speech, different words, different pronunciations change the particles that get expelled into the air. We know that when you speak, it increases the air velocity. So it's gone from about 1 meter a second to about 5 meters a second, depending on what it is that you are saying. And if you're singing, then you're increasing air velocity even more, and the range of particle sizes can be even greater. So I have to put a caveat here. All of this research has been done on people speaking English. We really don't know what happens if you're speaking other languages. But clearly there is a pattern here. And we know that 5 minutes of normal speaking English is going to produce about 3,000 respirable droplets that get into the air. We also know that what you're saying and how you're saying it changes those droplets. So if you say at the beginning of the pandemic, we had people saying, stay healthy. But when you put the TH sound together in a word like the, or health, or stealth, or north, that TH produces a large number of droplets. And you can see here, you can see the scattering of those droplets if you're using something like a stroboscopic laser system. You can illuminate the droplets. And so I started to tell everybody to say, be well, because when you say that, there are far fewer droplets produced. And so we can even look at the relationship between what gets into the environment and how people are actually speaking in that environment. And of course, this is why we look at wearing masks. Wearing masks protects other people from these droplets, as well as protecting you from breathing in droplets from elsewhere. And I could talk for a long time about masks, but I'm not going to. That's as much as I'll say. Now, of course, that's normal speech. What happens when you cough? Because we tend to cough whenever we get irritated, or one of the symptoms of getting respiratory diseases like cold or influenza, or even COVID, and it's not clear it is a respiratory disease, even though it affects the lungs. When you cough, you greatly accelerate the air leaving your lungs. In fact, you can now have air moving at more than 30 meters a second, and that air can now travel more than 6 meters. And when you cough, you can exhale up to about 100,000 droplets. So many, many more droplets, and in fact, a greater range of droplet sizes than when you just talk or sing. And you can see here from a number of studies that when you cough, one of the interesting things is that people who have respiratory problems, when they cough, they actually seem to tend to cough out smaller droplets, whereas people who don't have a respiratory problem tend to have a larger size range. But you can see from the chart on the right side here, if I can get that to work, that the majority of the droplets are 10 microns or less. And indeed, many of these droplets are around the low or 1 micron or even submicronic size. So these are droplets that are going to pass easily through most of the air filters that we typically use in buildings. When you cough, we also can look at that cough and see how quickly it travels and how far it travels. And you can see that very, very quickly, if an individual near you coughs and you're within 3 meters of that person, it's less than a minute. It's about 40 seconds before you're being exposed. And the other thing you'll notice is that the bulk of the material that's being coughed out here, right, is at that 3 meter distance. So it's not that when you cough, most of the material stays here and then it sort of declines over time or over distance, or both, sorry, but it's the fact that it really does get expelled out there. What happens when you sneeze? That's the other thing. When you sneeze, you can expel air at about 50 meters a second, and you can generate more than 2 million droplets. And those droplets have a much greater size range, up to about 100 microns. And if you think in terms of biological load, a droplet that size can have a lot of pathogenic organisms in it. And a sneeze can travel at least 8 meters. So here's a little video, you may have seen it, but this shows you what happens when you sneeze and then the importance of thinking about ventilation. So this is a video from researchers in Japan, where what they're doing is getting people to artificially sneeze, but then with the sneeze, they're actually visualizing that. They're using a high sensitivity camera. And what you're seeing in all of the illuminated little dots that are moving around, these are the micro droplets. These are droplets that are smaller than 10 microns. And you can see that they spread out and they stay in the air for a fairly long period of time. Even loud speech can generate these kinds of droplets. And so people who are anywhere around you, if you're in an environment where other people are talking or sneezing or coughing, then pretty quickly the air in that environment can start to fill with these droplets. And here you can see an example of that. And what happens when you open a window, the pressure difference will actually draw the air out of that room and sweep those droplets away. So how we design buildings is really important. So I don't have time to go into all the work that we know about droplets, but the transmission risk from droplets depends on the size of the droplet, the concentration, that is how many of those droplets in a size range are being produced, the velocity of the droplet, the temperature of the air, the relative humidity, the droplet velocity, the air velocity. The droplet can be carried on an airstream, whether the air is exposed to sunlight, and in particular certain wavelengths of ultraviolet C light, the type of pathogen, how large it is, how whether the pathogen can form a spore or not and can survive being exposed to external conditions for long periods of time, and then the transmission distance. So there are many factors that are going to affect this. So what have we done in the pandemic? Well, to try and minimize the risk of droplet transmission, in the US, we've talked about social distancing, and the distance chosen has been 6 feet, 1.8 meters. Why on earth have we done that? Well, if we go back again about 100 years, there was a major pandemic, a virus, an influenza virus, that actually infected about a third of the world's population. It killed about 50 million people worldwide. And remember, in 1918, although the concept of a virus was known, nobody had ever seen a virus. It wasn't until the electron microscope was developed in the 1930s that people were able to actually image what a virus was or what it looked like. But in that pandemic, in the USA, cities tried different kinds of strategies to reduce the transmission. They closed schools, shops, and restaurants, the very thing that we've been doing in the USA today. They restricted public transportation. They banned large public gatherings. They encouraged face masks, and then mandated social distancing, this 1.8 meters distance. And that was based on the fact that if you look at cities like San Francisco, where there was a spike in influenza cases and deaths, after bringing in the social distancing measures, when that second wave came, it was much less and much lower. And when you compared that to cities that didn't use social distancing, there was a difference, an obvious difference between the two. And of course, they also said coughs and sneezes spread diseases. So back in those days, people would cough or sneeze into a handkerchief, and they tried to train people to, cough into something, like cough into the ground. These days, we train children to cough into their elbows or sneeze into their elbows, not into their hands or any kind of handkerchief there. That pandemic was followed pretty quickly by an epidemic of a disease called tuberculosis, which of course is still around. And the reason that's important is that tuberculosis being caused by a bacterium, the bacteria is much larger than any virus. And people knew about bacteria. And this prompted a man called William Wells to begin to look at how do bacteria get transmitted in droplets that people breathe out, cough out, sneeze out. And so he undertook a range of studies, and this is his famous Wells evaporation curve. What you see in this curve is that he took the notion that you were going to start with the potential release of a droplet at a height of 2 meters above the ground, right? And that what you then do is look at how far did that droplet travel before it actually hit the ground, and how long did it take to do that. And what you can see from this curve is that for larger droplets, as the droplet falls through the air, it begins to evaporate. But if it's a large droplet, the rate of evaporation is still fairly low, so it hits the ground before it's completely evaporated. And in fact, he found that for most of the larger droplets, you got that evaporation, it hit the ground within a 2 meter distance from the source. That 2 meters, America still doesn't use the metric system, and that 2 meters got turned into 6 feet, right? And that became the 6 feet social distancing recommendation. He then looked at what's the effect of air humidity. Now, let me also go back and say all of this was done with air at 18 degrees Celsius. So our social distancing measures are still based on fairly cool air. What he then did was to look at what happens at different humidities. And you could see the higher the humidity, the quicker the droplet falls to the ground, because moisture isn't evaporating from the droplet. So the size of the droplet stays larger. In a dry environment, the droplet begins to evaporate and the droplet is smaller. So the effect of gravity is less and it travels further. But even so, he found that most of the droplets in normal air were still falling to the ground within his 2 meter distance. And so that became the basis for talking about, our social distancing. In America, we use 6 feet, which happens to be the US Navy's distance measure of 1 fathom, which is an old British measure, meaning the distance between your fingertips when your arms are outstretched. In the other parts of the world, this has been different. I actually don't know what it is in India, but you can see it varies. In some countries, and the World Health Organization has even said 1 meter is enough. I can't believe that for droplets. Other places like Canada has said 2 meters. The UK said 2 meters and then, 1 meter. And so, again, there's not been a lot of research on this, but this is where our ideas of social distancing come from. Now, why is this important? Well, because architects and designers are believing that we actually know what this magic number is. That means we will be safe from exposure to droplets. And American architects are talking now about redesigning workplaces to de-densify the workplace. In other words, providing everybody is going to be at least 2 meters away from another person, or sorry, in the US it's 1.8 meters, then there should be no health risks in that building from airborne diseases, which of course is patently nonsense. This is a study done by Dr. Sharma in London. There's real data looking at people moving around an office and looking at what happens when you change the occupancy level of that office. Everything in red means that 2 people are within 1.8 meters of each other. Everything in green means that person actually is, in quotes, safe. There's nobody within their sort of social bubble. You can see that even at 20% occupancy, you still don't have an environment in which people are not at some time within that sort of social bubble of other individuals. So I think it's hugely misleading on the part of architects and designers to talk to companies about simply changing the density of an indoor environment as a way of improving safety. And in fact, we now know if you look at different droplet sizes and different actions going from breathing, talking, coughing, sneezing, or hard sneezing, that smaller droplets can carry enormous distances, certainly larger or farther than a 6 meter distance. And there's no way that you can effectively have that kind of interpersonal distance in an environment. So although we talk about social distancing, which in the US is 1.8 meters, we know from various studies now of the aerosols coming from patients in hospitals and measuring how far those aerosols travel, that they can easily travel 4 meters or more. And in fact, the largest distance measured, and this is in air that is relatively still air, is nearly 9 meters. So it's not feasible to have people 9 meters apart to try and protect themselves. And in many environments, of course, social distancing itself simply may not be possible. The good news is here that in addition to being in close proximity, you have to be exposed for long enough to be able to get a viral load that's sufficient to cause disease. And outdoors, it seems that it's actually quite hard for that to happen. So most COVID-19 exposure occurs indoors, and it occurs in high-density indoor environments. And it often occurs in high-density indoor environments that have some kind of ventilation system, either mechanical ventilation or air conditioning. So what effect do these systems have on the movement of pathogenic particles? Again, you have to turn the clock back to the late 1800s, to the Houses of Parliament in London, where there were periodic instances of the politicians developing respiratory illnesses, developing feelings of a lack of fresh air, and feelings of sort of lassitude, and even the signs of respiratory disease. And so a man called Dr. Gordon was commissioned to actually figure out what should they be doing. The one idea was they should be hanging scented fabrics over the windows. Actually, I think that's a design that goes back to some of the palaces in India hundreds of years ago to try and improve the aroma of the air. But of course, for biological reasons, just having scented fabrics wouldn't be effective. But back in the early 1900s, nobody knew that. What Gordon did was rather remarkable, something I don't think many people would do today. He made an emulsion of a harmless bacterium. He put 200 little petri dishes all around the debating chamber, and then he gargled with this bacterial emulsion so that he was the source of the bacterium. And then he stood at the speaker's position in the chamber and he spoke for an hour reciting Shakespeare. And he did this with the ventilation system, the mechanical system turned off, and with the mechanical system turned on. And then and those were on different days. And then he collected the agar plates and the petri dishes, he incubated them, and he looked at what happened. He found that when the mechanical system was on, there was an increase in the number of plates that had bacterial colonies growing on them. He found that the plates directly in front of him had the greatest contamination, but that actually even plates that were 20 meters away from him showed contamination. And there was more of that happened when the ventilation system was on. In fact, the average count went from 151 bacterial colonies to almost 1,500 bacterial colonies. It was a tenfold increase almost. And so he concluded that mechanical ventilation could spread respiratory diseases. Remember the tuberculosis epidemic in 1920? That also prompted William Wells to start to look at that. What he did was he used rabbits and he exposed the rabbits either to air that didn't have tuberculosis bacteria in it, or to air that did have tuberculosis bacteria in it. And what he looked at then was air that had large particles with those bacteria and air that had small particles. So the larger particles were about 12 microns in diameter. The smaller ones were down to about 2 microns in diameter. So forget about the control condition. Clearly, those rabbits didn't develop any disease. But what he found was rabbits exposed to the fine particles developed far more disease. You can see here the number of tubercles in the lungs, the 3 lungs on the bottom, and those are the rabbits exposed to the finer particles. So we now know that, again, large particles don't get deep into the lungs. So they may lodge in the nose or the throat or the mucosa of the mouth, but it's the finer particles that have problems. And of course, a virus is an ultrafine particle. And so gradually, our knowledge has emerged that we can begin to make predictions about distance based on air velocities and thermal factors based on the size of the particle that we're interested in. And this is the sort of typical kind of model that you see out there. Unfortunately, it's not quite right, as you'll see. And that is because when we breathe air out, it is true that the larger droplets will move towards the ground because of gravity, and over time they will evaporate. But the finer droplets that we expel will actually go in the opposite direction, because typically we are breathing air out that's at 34 degrees Celsius. And for much of the year, again, it depends which country you're in, but you think about Wells research was all done with air at 18 degrees Celsius. So if you breathe out in that air, part of what you expel goes upwards. It's carried on a thermal plume. It doesn't simply go outwards. And with time, the particles are going to evaporate. Any moisture is going to evaporate, leaving behind the potential pathogenic organisms. And we know that if that happens to be a virus, that is most viruses are in the submicronic size range, that you can be looking at aerosol times that are well in excess of 24 or even 48 hours before that particle will actually settle out on the surface. So that's very different to, the big saliva droplets that you expel. We also know that COVID is somewhat unusual. With related viruses like influenza virus, we know that typically those viruses get inactivated within 1 to 2 hours of being in the air. But we now know that for COVID, it can remain airborne and it can remain infectious for at least 16 hours, right? That's a long time. So that means that somebody who has COVID, who's coughing and sneezing in a room, leaves the room, somebody else comes into that room the same day, they can still be exposed. And because COVID is so small, it's around 0.15 microns aerodynamic diameter, it can be in the air for many, many hours. So you don't even have to be with a person who has COVID to potentially get exposed to COVID. And so social distancing becomes irrelevant in those situations. So one of the big changes that's happened just in the last year has really been that air quality research has begun to look much more seriously at what happens, not just with PM 2.5 particles, but with PM1 particles and with ultrafine particles that are down to 1/10 of a micron in aerodynamic diameter. And these are really important in terms of pathogens. Now, why is that important and related to ventilation? One of the first cases of the spread of COVID was in a restaurant. A family had traveled from Wuhan to a city called Guangzhou in China. They didn't know that one of the family members was infected with COVID. They went to a restaurant, and at the end of that meal, people in the restaurant who were sitting close to these individuals, a number of those individuals became infected. In fact, if you look at the tables here, you'll see that table A, the person in yellow, A1 is the person who had COVID. You see that A2, 3, 4, and 5 were all sitting at the same table. They developed COVID, as did people sitting downwind of them. If you look on the right-hand side, you can see that over here, you've got the air conditioner blowing air in this direction, right? B1, 2, 3 developed COVID, but so did people sitting close to the air conditioner, which suggests again that the virus may have gotten into the air conditioner and was now being redistributed by that. So we now know that patterns of airflow turn out to be really important. You have to think about the inside of a building, not just in spatial terms, but in aerodynamic terms. Where is the air moving? We know that in moving air, particles like COVID can travel at least a 5-meter distance. And in fact, there's one study from Korea where this is an individual who developed COVID in a province where there hadn't been a case of COVID in 2 months. Right? And this person happened to go to a fast food restaurant, was only in that restaurant 5 minutes because the data comes from the GPS data on her cell phone. But it so happened that somebody else, a visitor from elsewhere who had COVID, went to that same restaurant. That person was 6.5 meters away from the young girl who got infected. And they were only in that environment for 5 minutes. And 2 other people also got infected. So we know that the patterns of air movement are really important here. We also know from major outbreaks in meat processing industries. This is in Germany, where 1 worker was infected, and that 1 worker eventually infected 1,500 colleagues. That the initial transfer of infection was over a distance of 8 meters. Now, in this particular environment, the air was cold, fairly cold, 10 degrees Celsius. There was no outdoor air coming in. It was constant air circulation. There was no sunlight in the environment. And that initial travel distance of 8 meters was enough to start infecting other workers, who then, of course, the virus went another distance to other workers and literally, in a fairly short space of time, infected 1,500 people. So environmental conditions are critical. And you can see something of that now in some of the CFD, the computational fluid dynamics simulations that are being done, looking at what happens. Here you can see the idea that we're introducing pathogens in through a ceiling air supply. The red spheres that you see are larger particles that quickly fall to the ground. The blue ones are the smaller particles, the finer particles, the aerosol particles. And you can see they can remain aloft for long periods of time, and they can travel far greater distances. And we think these are the particles that pose the most risk of infection if you're in an indoor environment. So you only need 1 person to be infected to cough, sneeze, sing, breathe into the environment, and those finer particles can get pulled into the ventilation system in the building, transferred through the building, and dumped elsewhere in the building. What this means is when we look at our American workplaces, like these open office designs, they are totally ineffective in managing exposure to any pathogens, whether that's bacterial disease or whether it's a virus like COVID or any other disease. There have been various attempts to try and protect workstations. This is one idea, to cover a workstation in sort of a dome like this. But I'll show you some data that shows this is not the most effective way to do that. In the USA, we've seen an increase in people rushing to buy sneeze guards. So when you cough and sneeze, at least the larger droplets will impact on these surfaces and maybe not get transferred elsewhere. There's been an increased interest in putting panels around these open workplaces. But in work that I've been doing with Florida Atlantic University, you'll see that one of the problems is that the panels don't stop all the particles. So here what you're seeing is, clearly a mannequin that's coughed out particles that approximate the size range. About half of those hit a panel, and this panel is 3/4 meter high. But because of the thermal plume, you can see how they rise up, go over the top of this barrier, and then as the air cools, those particles then begin to fall down into the seated breathing zone of other people. Or if you happen to be walking past the edge of this barrier, the particles are already at standing height, and in fact, fairly quickly, they'll get carried into the ventilation system to be distributed elsewhere. So what happens if you put an air filter into that same environment? On the right-hand side, you'll see something with lights on. That's the air filter. The air filter has some effect, but not an enormous effect, because, of course, the particles are exiting on an airstream before they can actually get into the filter. And this is why simply changing the filter in an air conditioning system doesn't necessarily help enormously if if the risk is person-to-person transmission, because by the time that air gets through the filter, other people will have been exposed to that. So what happens if you then cover that over? If you create not just 3 surfaces, but 4 surfaces, like a ceiling, like the plexiglass pods that I showed you. Well, what happens there is the particles do get trapped. They don't go over into the adjacent space, but actually eventually what happens is those particles will start to move backwards and come out behind the person's head. Here you can see now how they've begun to move backwards. But what happens if you use an air filter in this environment? Then now the air filter is much more effective and can pretty quickly start to clear the air. And that will stop particles from escaping outside of that sort of space, that enclosed space. So we actually have companies in the USA now who are making portable pods, portable enclosures like this, that you wear it like you'd wear a backpack or a rucksack, and you walk around and you unzip it to be able to use your computer, but it minimizes the transmission. And this is one way to go, and you can get more expensive versions of this that actually have air filtration systems built into them. But is that the only thing you can do? We know if you have partitions in the space, if you have walls that go from floor to ceiling, that can help to reduce the movement of particles. If you force the particles to only move around through an air conditioning system, then you can reduce the risk of exposure from office workers. So how should we all protect ourselves from these droplets and aerosols? Being outdoors is definitely protective. Wearing a face mask, and a high quality one, is really effective, and it's socially responsible. You are not breathing droplets from other people, and they're not breathing your droplets. But we also know this virus can get into the body through the eyes, because there are receptors on cells on the surface of the eye that are accessible by the virus. So you need a face shield, or you need to wear spectacles. Just wearing spectacles reduces your risk by about 30%. You want to avoid crowds. You want to try and socially distance whenever possible. And of course, wash and sanitize your hands. So those are personal things that people can do. What can we do to protect our buildings? Well, the easiest and obvious thing is open windows. Now, in the past, we've said close windows when the outdoor air is polluted. Now we have a dilemma because when you close the window, you increase the risk of indoor exposure and you have a trade-off. Is it better to deal with more pollution from outdoors that may have a long-term effect on health, but reduce the chance of COVID? Or is it better to protect yourself against that long-term pollutant and expose yourself more to the risks of COVID? I suspect in the short term, opening windows, even in a more polluted environment, is going to protect your immediate health. But of course, design does this. If you look at some of your traditional designs in India that are open designs that maximize cross ventilation, the chances, if you're working in an environment that looks anything like this, the chances of COVID exposure are dramatically less than if you're in a crowded, call center or other air-conditioned environment. We know if you are crowded together, then the risk of transmission and exposure of droplets and aerosols is much greater. Cubicle spaces are better, but of course, individual private offices are by far the best in reducing that transmission. Modern ventilation systems in the last 100 years, going from the work of Willis Carrier developing air conditioning, have tended to be based on energy and on thermal comfort. Their design has not been based on airborne disease transmission and health, and that now is changing. We are seeing the desire to use better filters in HVAC systems, and even though they might not prevent an initial exposure, over time they will clean the air in an environment. And if you look at filter quality, you see you need to get to at least a MERV 13 or higher filter to really begin to dramatically reduce the filtration of a virus. This actually was work done on an influenza virus. But even at MERV-13 is going to only reduce that by about 90%. But hopefully that other 10% gets diluted so much that the viral load you're exposed to is not that great. Using germicidal ultraviolet C in a ventilation system turns out to be really important. And I think that technology is being used in some buildings in India, where you're using it within the room, and that's a great way of using it as well. But in a ventilation system, putting it either before or after the coils, or in both locations, or sometimes in the ducts, is really effective. And we know from research studies that that reduces the airborne load for not just microorganisms, but also for molecules like the endotoxins in the air. And that reduces the illness that people experience. So how can you predict all of this? Well, fortunately, MIT has developed a very, very nice little piece of web-based software that lets you estimate the risk of exposure to COVID. You input the dimensions of a room. So say a 6x6 room, you put the number of people in there, what they're doing, assuming, normal speaking, average humidity, no masks. Its calculator will then make a prediction that in that room, you can be there for 18 minutes before you will be exposed to a potential dose of COVID that could cause problems. If you're wearing a crude mask, that goes to 20 minutes. If you can open a window, it goes up to 26 minutes. If you're wearing a surgical mask, but your nose is outside it, it goes to 32 minutes. If you're correctly wearing a surgical mask, you can be in that environment for 2 hours, 120 minutes before you develop or potentially develop the risk of being infected with COVID. This is the calculator. It includes things like the type of room, the area of the room, ceiling heights, the kind of ventilation system, ventilation rate, humidity, windows, how many people, what are they wearing, are they sitting or standing, are they whispering, talking, or singing? And you can see that it then tells you, it estimates how many people can be in there for how many minutes before there is a serious risk that they'll develop COVID. So that's a really useful way. You can show this, for example, shows with no mask, and you can see in this room 10 people in this particular environment. Well, it'll be unsafe after 73 minutes. And if we turn that to high quality masks, those 10 people can stay in that same room for 2 days before it's a risk that they'll catch COVID. So I think we can look forwards to redesigning environments that are actually based on some of the things we used to do in the past before we knew about pathogenic airborne organisms. We need to encourage people to wear personal protective equipment. That's still the best way of managing your personal exposure to an airborne pathogen. But we also now know that the risks are going to be less if you have a private office rather than a shared office, if you have windows that can open rather than windows that are sealed, if you have walls that go all the way to the ceiling, if you have a high ceiling, if you have a door that you can close, and if you have either a perimeter ventilation system or you have room germicidal ultraviolet, or if you have a central heating, ventilation, air conditioning system, you need to have good quality filters and preferably have germicidal ultraviolet in there. If you can do all of these things, you will really protect not only yourself, but also any workforce against exposure. So we spend most of our lives indoors. This is really absolutely critical that we design environments in a healthy way in the future, and we retrofit existing environments, because this pandemic is not the last pandemic that we're going to face. So again, if we think of other viruses as simply being small particles, we can create very effective environments for dealing with exposures. So along with everything I've said, I want to thank you for questions. Keep wearing your masks and keep yourselves safe. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Alan.
I'll now turn off my sharing if I can find where I do that here. I'll stop sharing. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Alan, for fantastic talk. I'm sure there may be a lot of questions. So there are already few questions in the chat box. I will go one by one for you to answer. So there is a question from Gautam Tiwari. He's asking that as air is is constituting of many different gases, are there any chemical reactions that may influence the impact of this disease transmission?
That is a great question, and the answer is yes. And we know that one gas that's very effective is ozone. Right? So if you can generate ozone in an environment, that will have the effect of deactivating the virus. Now, the problem is, of course, that ozone is a gas that is toxic to us at high exposures. But ozone being a very reactive gas, that means that over distance, it quickly reacts and becomes other compounds. So you can put an ozone system into a ventilation system, into an air handling unit, and that will have the effect also of helping to deactivate the virus.
Yeah. So there's another question that initial studies suggested that COVID virus thrives in low temperature. However, later on, there are some studies which say otherwise. So the question was basically that, can you comment on the dependence of this transmission on temperature and relative humidity?
The answer is yes, there is a dependence there, and I can actually give you a temperature. If you give me a minute, I will do that. Yeah. So one of the things that has been found is that COVID has been detected on certain foods that have been kept in cold storage. Right. Remember, outside the body, the virus is not active. It's not alive in the traditional sense, but it can survive a range of conditions. So certainly cooking food is much better than eating cold food. And if you give me a second, let me see if I can find a temperature effect here. Well, let me just say, I can provide that. There is some data showing that as air temperature increases, you will get less and less activity with COVID. Now, part of that is you've got to be a little bit careful. There is a new design of an air filter. It's not yet commercial, but what it does, the surface of the air filter heats up. So think of a filter where you can heat just the surface. And that means that as the virus lands on the surface, it quickly gets deactivated. But the temperature is local. It doesn't heat the air very much. So it's like if you could have, for example, you could have a plate of metal that's very hot. So you put your hand on it, it will burn you, but it's not a very good way of increasing air temperature. So there are some new technologies coming along that will do this. And certainly temperature is a way of decreasing the activity of COVID and deactivating it.
Yeah, so I think we have passed the time, but we'll take few more questions which are quite interesting. So one question, Alan, is that existing techniques to measure bioaerosols are quite expensive and require lab analysis. So do you know of any sensor technologies which can measure these viruses in real time?
Well, the answer to this is no and yes, right? Remember what I said was, if you forget about the virus as a virus and think about it as an ultrafine particle, we can measure ultrafine particles with relatively inexpensive equipment, right? Of course, we don't know what those particles are, but we can hypothesize that if you can reduce the the quantity of ultrafine particles, by definition, you're reducing the number of potential COVID viruses there, because it's simply an ultrafine particle. So yes, when you get into biological measurement, then it gets complicated and it gets expensive.
Yeah, there is another question on potential impact of sunlight on airborne virus spread in the outdoor conditions.
Yes, well, sunlight will deactivate the virus with time. So in sunlight, we think about the ultraviolet, but most sunlight is not in the wavelength that has the effect on the virus. So there are three groups of wavelengths: ultraviolet A, ultraviolet B, ultraviolet C. Ultraviolet C tend to be wavelengths that the key wavelength that deactivates the virus is around 260 nanometers. Right? That's because that's what disrupts the ribonucleic acid that's in the virus. It causes the uracil to form a dimer. Most ultraviolet C light gets filtered out from the sun by the time it gets to the ground. So ultraviolet A and ultraviolet B have some effect, but the most effective ultraviolet gets filtered out. So yes, it takes time for that to happen, but there should be an effect.
And there is another question on if air purifier help people inside.
The answer is over time, yes. But you have to, but it depends on a number of things, right? It depends on how good is that air purifier at filtering. Because what the air purifier is also doing is moving air around. So let's suppose you have two people that are in a room, and that room is 3 meters long and 3 meters wide. And one person is at one end of the room and one's at the other end of the room. One person has COVID, they're coughing and sneezing. If you move the air around, you might speed up how quickly the other person gets exposed. But if that air cleaner is in between those two people, and drawing the infected air in and cleaning it, then you're protecting the person. So looking at where the air cleaner is and thinking about how that affects the potential exposure is really important. So the answer is yes, air cleaners, the right kind of air cleaners probably can help. Here in the US, we're starting to put those into school classrooms. And certainly over time, they should help, right? They should help keep the air cleaner. But think of it, forget the virus, think about a cigarette, right? Cigarette smoke, some of those particles can be thought of as almost like viruses. You know, if you light a cigarette, in fact, this would be a good test for a person to do. If you light a cigarette in one place, how quickly does the air cleaner remove that smoke? You know, because if it takes a long time to do that, then you potentially, if you replace the smoke with a virus, you're going to be exposed before the air gets into the air cleaner.
Yeah, so we'll just take two more questions. One question is that eyes being the least common mode of transmission, how can it act as an entryway? Does it mean eyes and tears could serve as a source of infection?
Not the ears. So this particular virus tends to target cells that have a receptor on the cell surface called an ACE2 receptor. Right? And the ACE2 receptors tend to be in places like the lungs, in the GI system, and it so happens that they're in the eyes. So that's why, again, we don't know whether it's airborne to the eyes or whether it's somebody touching a surface and then rubbing their eyes, right? But we do know there is some research showing that wearing eye coverings gives some protection against developing COVID-19. So it's because of that receptor. And the ACE2 receptor tends to be found more in men than women. in terms of its impact. And so we see a difference in the mortality rate, in the death rate between men and women. And children tend to have less of this receptor than adults, so they seem to be less susceptible than adults.
Yeah, last question is quite interesting. I mean, very relevant also for India. The question is that in hot countries like India, cooling of buildings is very important, particularly in the summer. And most of the common cooling appliances like fans, they increase the air circulation. So, what, in your opinion, could be the most suitable cooling methods in this condition?
Well, a fan does not affect air temperature, right? A fan affects the rate of heat loss from air movement over your skin. Your perception of temperature is not a simple relationship to the air temperature. It's going to be impacted by factors like humidity. So a lower temperature of humid air can feel warmer than a higher temperature of dry air, right? So you have to look at multiple environmental factors there. A fan moves air around, and that air evaporates moisture from your skin, and that has the effect of cooling your skin. Simple things: not wearing a shirt or not wearing a garment that is closed at the neck, right? Having an open neck allows you to be in an environment that's 2 degrees Celsius warmer without any perception that the environment is warmer. Don't fall in. If you look at what's happened in the US, the research, the original work on air conditioning, Willis Carrier was a graduate student of Cornell. His original work on air conditioning was actually done for a company that is in upstate New York, and that means it's very cold in the wintertime there. And in fact, that's where he got the idea. He saw the cold air, that you've got the dew, a fog over the ground when the air was cooled down, and that brought moisture out of the air. Right? You have to look at the environment. I would say one thing that has impressed me on my visits to India, I've been a couple of times now, is when you go back and look at how buildings were designed hundreds of years or maybe thousands of years ago, before air conditioning, right? They were designed in a really sensible way. They were designed to maximize air movement through the building. There was no way of taking odors out of the air or anything. They were maximized for airflow. They maximize cool air movement because, again, if you bring warm air, if it touches a cool surface like stone, I think I saw in some of the buildings, the stone walls, but water was running behind them to cool the stone down. I mean, these principles are the same essentially as air conditioning. They just weren't called air conditioning. Hanging wet cloth that the air would blow through. The work of Yaglu back in the 1930s looked at that. How good is air as a way of cooling and cleaning the air? Passing air effect of a waterfall is really an effective way of cooling and cleaning air. So I think what this is pointing to is that in different climates, you can look back at some of the traditional technologies and think of how can you bring those into the modern world. For goodness sake, don't just take what has been done in America and apply it there, because air conditioning is very energy intensive and it's very wasteful. And in terms of global climate change, it doesn't help. Singapore showed that the air conditioners, remember, they have to send the heat somewhere. They're sending the heat outdoors, and the average temperature has gone up there significantly with the mass use of air conditioning units. So going back and looking at what could you take from some traditional designs, I think is the way to look to the future, to sustainable designs.
Thank you, Alan. Still, there are a few more questions, but in the interest of time, I will request those whose questions are not answered, please write to Professor Hage. I'm sure he will be happy to answer them. Before we end, I want to request Mr. Arun Duggal, if you have any comments or any questions for Alan. Otherwise, we'll end today's presentation.
I will just like to thank Professor Hedge for a very, very enlightening talk and a very mind-provoking thought. And I'm delighted that he has pointed out that all around us in India, there are older technologies which probably are now not used that much, but we must go back and look at them and see how we can reinstitute them in our system. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank
you,
you
Professor.
very much.
Yeah, it was great to host you and learn a lot from you. We hope to continue interacting with you. Thank you very much.
I hope so as well. And I hope one day I get to visit again. Thank you all very much. Thank you for your time. Bye. Bye, Henry.
Bye, everyone. Have a good day. Bye-bye.